Excellent. So, welcome everyone. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, and it's a genuine pleasure for me to be hosting this event today, focused on Michael Sandel's brilliant book, The Tyranny of Merit, What's Become of Common Good, which I have right here. I had read the book when it first came out in 2020, and I read it again last week in advance of this, and I have to say I enjoyed it even more second time round. It really is a compelling account of the shortcomings of meritocracy, and that we've maybe come to question too little recently. It reflects a key theme of our work here at the Policy Institute at King's on inequality, meritocracy, and mobility. And it's the same for our partners in this event series that we're putting together, the Fairness Foundation, which is a new initiative which is launching next week, which is looking to change the terms of the debate about fairness in the UK. And at that launch next week, it will be publishing its vision of a fair society, which it's calling The Fair Necessities, which was written in collaboration with Will Hutton. So Michael needs very little introduction, so just some very brief highlights. He is the Anti and Robert M. Bass Professor of Government at Harvard University, and is described as the world's most influential living philosopher by the New Statesman. Michael's books on justice, ethics, democracy, and markets have been translated into more than 30 languages, and his now legendary course, Justice, was the first Harvard course to be made freely available online. Has been viewed by tens of millions of people around the world now. And The Tyranny of Merit, which we're focusing on today, was a TLS, Guardian, and New Statesman Book of the Year in 2020. So we'll hear from Michael, then we'll have responses from a brilliant panel that we've been put together to discuss some of the themes that we've heard today. First up, we will have Joe Littler, who is Professor of Socioanalysis and Cultural Analysis at City University of London, and has written widely on the issues that we'll be talking about today, including her own excellent book, Against Meritocracy, Culture, Power, and the Myths of Mobility. Then we'll have Adrian Wooldridge, who is political editor of The Economist and writes the magazine's Budget column. Again, he's written a great deal about issues of meritocracy, including his latest book, The Aristocracy of Talent, How Meritocracy Made the Modern World, which was published just this year, another great book on the subject. And finally, we're really delighted to have our excellent King's Philosophy Department represented on the panel here by Maria Alvarez, who is Professor of Philosophy and head of the department, and writes again around the philosophical challenges around so many of these issues. After the contributions, we'll have a bit of discussion between the panel, but also plenty of time for questions from you. Do put your questions into the Q&A function and try to get them in early. We had over 1,300 signups for this event, so earlier questions have got more chance of being picked out. Given we've only got an hour, we're going to hand straight over to Michael to give his opening thoughts on this. Michael.
Thank you, Bobby, and thanks for having us at King's. It's really an honor to share the Zoom screen with this remarkable group, Adrian, who's written a formidable defense of meritocracy, Joe Littler, who's written a fierce critique of it, and Maria Alvarez, who has thought deeply about all of these questions. So it's really a privilege for me. The tyranny of merit. How can merit be a kind of tyranny? Normally, we think of merit as a good thing, and it is, if we mean merit simply as competence, being well qualified for a job. If I need surgery, I want a well-qualified surgeon to perform it. If I fly in an airplane, I certainly want a well-qualified pilot at the controls. So how does merit become a tyranny? Well, it becomes a kind of tyranny when it devolves into meritocracy, which is different from simply aligning people's skills with their jobs. Meritocracy is an ethic. It's an ethic of deservingness, and it's a system of rule based on the attribution of moral desert. And by system of rule, I mean a way of allocating income and wealth, power and honor on the basis of who deserves these good things. In the book, I make a philosophical argument against meritocracy and also point to the political difficulties to which it's led us. The philosophical argument, simply put, is this: the appeal of meritocracy, especially if we compare it with other ways of allocating social roles and rewards, like nepotism and cronyism and corruption and class-based aristocratic privilege. The appeal of meritocracy is that it assigns income and wealth and power and honor not on the basis of arbitrary facts, contingencies, accidents of birth, no doing of ours, like whether you're born into a rich family or a poor one. It allocates the good things in life based on our own doing, based on what we've earned, and therefore based on what we deserve. Problem is this: talent. Do we really deserve our talents? Can it be said that our talents are our own doing? Whenever you think about the attribution of deservingness based on talent or effort and talent, it's helpful to think of a concrete case. Take a great footballer, Lionel Messi. He just went from Barcelona to Paris. What does he make in a year? He makes about, I think, about $41 million a year. Think of your most important teacher in school. What does he or she make? Less than $41 million a year, to be sure. Quite a bit less. The moral question is, can we really say that Messi deserves to make 1,000 times more than your best teacher in school, or than a nurse or a doctor caring for COVID patients? Now, you might say, well, Lionel Messi has to work hard and train hard, and surely he did. But effort alone is not the basis of the meritocrat's claim. I could practice football 24 hours a day for a lifetime and never be as good as Messi. And I don't think even the convinced meritocrat would say that because I hypothetically worked harder practicing football, I should be paid more than Messi. The fact that Messi is gifted, a greatly gifted athlete, that's a good thing. It makes him a splendid football player. But those talents are gifts, however hard he may practice to develop them, not his own doing, and therefore not the basis of moral desert. And secondly, the fact that he makes 41 million depends not only on his stupendous talents, but also on the fact that he happens to live in a society and at a time that loves football and rewards it handsomely. But that too is not his doing. That happy accident is his good luck. If Messi lived back in the days of the Renaissance, they didn't care much about football then, nor did they reward it as handsomely. They cared more about fresco painters. So there are two contingencies that account for the outsized rewards that Messi makes compared to your best teacher in school, neither of which is his doing. Having the talents in the first place and living in a society that prizes them in the second. That's the philosophical argument. The political worry is this: meritocracy initially seemed a liberation from inequality, the inequalities of caste systems, hereditary aristocracies, class-based societies. If everyone can start with an equal chance, goes the meritocratic ideal, then the winners can be said to deserve their winnings. But is that the case? Is meritocracy really an alternative to inequality? Or is it, as I think today it functions, a justification for inequality? In recent decades, the divide between winners and losers in our societies has been deepening, poisoning our politics, setting us apart. This has partly to do with the widening inequalities of income and wealth. But it's not only that. It has also to do with changing attitudes towards success that have accompanied the rising inequalities. Those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that they therefore deserve the full measure of the bounty that the market lavishes upon them. And by implication, that those who struggle, those who fall short, have no one to blame but themselves. This way of thinking about success arises from the seemingly attractive principle of meritocracy, from the principle that says, if chances are equal, the winners deserve their winnings. Now, you might say, well, the problem is simply that we don't live up to this ideal. If we really could bring everyone to the same starting point, then the winners of the race would deserve the winnings. But the problem isn't only that we fail to realize the ideal. The ideal itself is flawed. Meritocracy has a dark side. The dark side is that it's corrosive of the common good, and here's why. It leads to hubris among the winners and humiliation for those who lose out. It encourages the successful to inhale too deeply of their success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way. And it leads them to look down on those less fortunate than themselves. One of the most potent sources of the populist backlash against elites that we saw with the vote for Brexit, that we saw with the election of Donald Trump, is the sense among many working people that elites look down on them. It's a legitimate complaint. Even as globalization was deepening inequality and creating stagnant wages, its proponents offered workers some bracing advice. If you want to compete and win in the global economy, they said, go to university. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. How many times have we heard politicians intone this mantra? The elites who offered meritocracy as the response to the inequalities of income and wealth and power of recent decades, these elites failed to notice the insult implicit in their advice. The insult was this: if you didn't go to university, and if you're not flourishing in the new economy, your failure must be your fault. So it's no wonder that many working people turned against meritocratic elites. So what should we do? Well, among other things, we should remember the fact that mobility is not a sufficient response to the stagnant wages and to the inequalities of income and wealth, but also of social esteem that recent decades have produced. We should remember, as many of us can easily forget, that most of our fellow citizens don't have a university degree. Nearly 2/3 of Americans don't, and in Britain, the figure is roughly similar. So it's folly to create an economy that sets as a necessary condition for dignified work and a decent life a university degree that most people don't have. In short, we should shift our political project and our public discourse. We should focus less on arming people for a meritocratic race and focus more on making life better for those who may lack a diploma, but who nonetheless make essential contributions to our society, to the common good. through the work they do, the families they raise, and the communities they serve. And this would mean putting the dignity of work at the center of our politics, rather than the project of helping people clamber up the ladder of success, even as the rungs on the ladder grow further and further apart. Martin Luther King, shortly before he was assassinated, went to Memphis, Tennessee, and spoke to a group of striking sanitation workers. And what he said to them was this. He said, in the final analysis, the person who picks up your garbage is as important, as significant as the physician. Because if he doesn't do his job, diseases will be rampant. And then he added, all labor has dignity. So this it could be the slogan, the moral shift that could orient a project about the dignity of work. And more than that, those of us who have enjoyed some measure of success in whatever endeavor, I think need to question our meritocratic hubris. We need to ask whether we morally deserve the talents that enable us to flourish. We need to ask whether it's our doing, my doing, that I live in a society that happens to prize the talents I have. Insisting that my success is my due makes it hard to see myself in other people's shoes. Appreciating the role of luck in life can prompt a certain humility. There, but for the accident of birth, or the grace of God, or the mystery of fate, go I. This spirit of humility is the civic virtue we need now, it seems to me. It's the beginning of the way back from the harsh ethic of success that drives us apart. It points, this sense of humility could point us beyond the tyranny of merit toward a less rancorous, more generous public life. Thanks, Bobby.
Well, thank you, Michael. That was excellent. Brilliant overview. Thank you so much. So straight on to Jo for your thoughts, please.
Hello, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here to discuss both the topic and this wonderful book, which shows how the idea of meritocracy has been used to work against the common good. I think its analysis of meritocratic hubris and its relationship to populism are particularly astute and helpful. The book also contributes to a rapidly growing and interdisciplinary understanding and critique of meritocracy, of what it means and of how it's been used, which has expanded over the past decade. As it becomes clearer and clearer that this is a word which sounds egalitarian, but which has been wielded by a plutocratic elite to justify extreme inequality. As I've written about, it's a word that started out its life as a socialist slur. It was first used by the industrial sociologist Alan Fox in 1956, and widely understood in the 50s and 60s as an unfair way to organise society. Why should huge economic rewards be heaped on the already gifted and privileged? But it then became popularised by the new right from the 1980s to push market-based competition and the dismantling of social democracy at any cost. The book is a major contribution to this field in multiple ways. It's beautifully written. It's fantastic to see it having such far-reaching impact. However, I would say that whilst it's very good on ethnicity, that I don't think there's quite enough on gender, either in terms of drawing from the many female scholars who've written on this topic, like Lani Gounier or Natasha Waraku, or in elaborating the many gendered social barriers to achievement, from insufficient paternity leave to sex discrimination at work. So I think I'd like to see the intersectional dynamics of meritocracy becoming more discussed and elaborated, because the fight against inequality always needs to ensure it doesn't inadvertently work to shore up other inequalities along the way. I also think that right now we need to pay more attention to the shape-shifting political cultures of meritocracy, which can be complex. So, for example, Trump rose to power rebelling against meritocracy, but he also used it by suggesting he'd only allow people into the US based on merit, and by endlessly harping on about how he worked hard and deserved his wealth. And in the UK right now, we're being presented with a kind of a different and specific constellation of cultural messages about meritocracy from our political leaders that are worth looking at and examining. So through the language of levelling up, we're being thrown a few rhetorical bones about levelling the playing field, which failed to materialise in reality. And simultaneously, I think there's what I describe as a wrecking ball approach being taken to the structures and institutions whose job it is to deal with inequality. Take, for example, the government's recent Sewell report on ethnic disparities. This denies the existence of institutional racism, describes Britain as a beacon of progressiveness, says the problem is bad families, and argues that we should get rid of the term BAME in favour of opportunity for all. Or take the appointment of anti-feminists as new commissioners on the Equality and Human Rights Commission, people who say women should just buck up in their attitude and not simply be victims rather than tackling discrimination. So in other words, I think in the UK, there's an escalation of direct attacks on any account of or attempt to redress structural social inequalities in favour of a language of wholly individualised merit. And this is being used in order to extend the power of market-based capitalism, which benefits but a few and increases inequality. I think if we want any playing field at all, rather than greater economic inequality, social division, and environmental destruction, we have to argue against this and to resist it in favour of the common good.
Oh, thank you, Jo. That was great. And straight on to Adrian, actually. Let's keep moving.
Yeah, I might say something a little bit different from what we've just heard. I think, firstly, I mean, Michael has a problem with the definition of meritocracy. I think meritocracy means open competition. It means some sort of equality of opportunity, or at least a mass educational system. But he presented a very narrow view of meritocracy, which is basically America, modern America, with very high degrees of inequality and an extreme preoccupation with academic success to the exclusion of others. I think you can have a meritocracy which looks for many hierarchies of success and which has less social inequality. So Germany has a flourishing vocational educational system, apprenticeship system. Scandinavia has much lower levels of inequality. Both of those countries, I think, are meritocracy in the sense of mass education, open competition, laws against prejudice or discrimination in hiring. I think Michael is right to say that meritocracy is a progressive force, at least at first, but I think he's wrong to say that it ceases to be a progressive force. Meritocracy, first of all, got rid of caste-based societies, aristocratic-based societies, status-based societies, but it proved to be self-expanding and self-reinforcing in the sense that meritocracy is open from mainly white men who designed it in the first place, or middle-class white men who designed it in the first place, to include women, to include ethnic minorities, and to include all sorts of suppressed groups, particularly the working class, who seized on the notion of merit and said, what about us? We're meritorious too. We have an ability to thrive under systems of open competition. And indeed, you think Michael talked about Martin Luther King, but of course, Martin Luther King's great statement was judge each person by the content of their character rather than by racial prejudice, the individual ability, and judging people as individuals absolutely at the heart of the meritocratic ideal. I think there's an issue that eludes him in his book, which is the issue of productivity. How do you create the economic surplus which makes a welfare state, a generous society, a mass educational system, all of these things that we value? How do you create that economic surplus? I think a key to productivity is meritocracy, is appointments on the basis of ability to perform certain functions well. And you can compare family companies with public companies. You can compare meritocratic societies like broadly the United States or Germany with nepotistic societies like Italy and Greece. And on each of these, or you can compare, let's say, Sri Lanka with Singapore, which is the world's most meritocratic society. And each time you see on the meritocratic end of things, a higher level of productivity, which makes the pursuit of the common good possible because we have a surplus. I think he's wrong on the question of deserts, which is the most fundamental of these things, because although we don't deserve the fact that society prizes this or that virtue, although we don't deserve our innate abilities, which we owe to genetics, we nevertheless need to work hard in order to turn an innate talent into a real marketable ability. Everybody who gets to the forefront of their profession, their skill, whether they're Lionel Messi or whether they're a first-class philosopher at Harvard University, does so by working hard and mixing their labor with their talent. And we do deserve a reward for that, for living a laborious life. And I think any society which doesn't reward people on the basis of effort is probably going to fall apart. And finally, I'll just make one more point before I stop, which is an issue which is not really discussed in this book, is what is the alternative? Not discussed satisfactorily in the book. What is the alternative to meritocracy? Is the alternative to give people positions on the basis of group ascription, which is increasingly the woke alternative, that you have to have a certain reserved caucus for people on the basis of their gender or race? I think that's going back to pre-modern sort of criteria for judging people, and puts race and gender right at the heart of judgments of competence, which I think is a very regressive thing to do. Or should we go to a much fuller version of equality of the sort that you have in Venezuela or Cuba or fully socialist societies? Again, that leads to poverty and a lack of freedom. And finally, to address Michael's point, which is competence, he says, let's have a selection amongst the competent. I think that's a witheringly awful way of selecting people. I've worked for The Economist for 32 years. I've never, ever seen us select somebody saying, oh, he's a competent journalist. Let's appoint the competent journalist. You don't, as a successful organization, appoint people on the basis of competence. You appoint them because they're the best. You appoint them on the basis of excellence. And anything that is less than that leads to institutional status and either complacency or just decline. So please, let's appoint the best, not the merely good or competent or sufficient. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Adrian. Some great points and challenge there. If you don't mind, Michael, we'll hold on to those and then come back for the discussion at the end, because I do want to hear from Maria next, please.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here. I think my comments are going to be a little bit in between and more on the philosophical side between the 2 points we've heard. So I think, before reading books like The Tyranny of Merit, one might think that meritocracy is surely a good thing. As Adrian just said, allocate the principle that educational opportunity, jobs, positions of power should be allocated on the basis of merit, understood as skills, aptitude, experience, and so on, that enable people to do those jobs well and to benefit from the opportunities, rather than on the basis of birth or connections, must be the right thing. What you know, rather than who you know or who your parents are, should be what matters. And what could be wrong with that? I think Michael answers that question by depicting vividly some deeply pernicious aspects of meritocracy as it has been developed in the USA, and in different ways, perhaps in the UK a little and perhaps elsewhere. And his diagnosis, as we heard, is that meritocracy has this ethics of personal responsibility and striving that fosters the idea that my success is my doing, and similarly that those who fail have no one but themselves to blame. So we are responsible for our fate, and therefore it seems we deserve, perhaps morally deserve, success, credit for success and discredit for failure. So, and for Michael, this is harmful because it undermines respect for others and commitment to the common good, but it's also unwarranted, and this is the philosophical point, because it ignores the moral arbitrariness of talents and inflates the significance of effort. So I think I share a lot of values, Michael's values, but I think I'm not wholly persuaded by one aspect of the argument. And I think it's true that to judge moral credit and discredit by success and failure does ignore the part that luck and other people play in our lives. But I think, on the other hand, repudiating altogether the significance of human agency and freedom, as Michael appears to want to do, seems to me as mistaken as meritocratic hubris, just the opposite extreme. Perhaps the parable of talents in the gospel seems opposite to me here, at least on some of its more benign interpretations. the message is that each one of us has a duty to strive to make the most of the talents and opportunities that we have. This seems to me a call to make choices and to exercise our agency in ways aimed at making the best of what we've been given by nature, God, or fate. And it's obviously true that whether we succeed will not be up to us, but I think the point is whether we try often is up to us. Now, one can make familiar objections that Michael makes in the book. One is that, even emphasizing the importance of effort and striving underplays the role of luck. For whether I'm the sort of person who, as it were, is inclined to try it, who will try it, is not up to me, it's not my doing. I agree with this objection, but only up to a point. I think we are born with certain inclinations and tendencies, but I don't believe we are powerless in what we make of them. Although, of course, that also depends on our opportunities, partly on luck. I was unlucky that my efforts weren't successful. It's often an unacceptable excuse. But I was unlucky to be born so lazy that I just wouldn't make the effort. It's less convincing. I think we don't make our characters, but I think we can work on them. Now, the other objection is that this emphasis on the role of agency, personal responsibility, and so on, tends to moralize actual failure of success, to take them as the standard to judge people morally. And that brings us back to hubris. Now, I agree that it's wrong to moralize the way our lives go, but I think it's possible to resist that urge, not least because those judgments are very invidious, without giving up the importance of personal agency and responsibility. So I think all in all, I'm still inclined to think that meritocracy, like democracy, is better than the alternatives. I agree with Michael that the meritocracy we have in most places is seriously flawed, and that we need to recover that sense of the true value of work and a commitment to the common good. But I think we can't do that without a deep sense of moral responsibility, which Michael's understandable opposition to moral hubris tends to erase.
Great, thank you so much, Maria, as well. So I think if we can just spend a little bit of time picking up on the themes, Michael, that the panelists have put back to you, I think that could be good. I mean, it sort of very much reflects some of the comments that are coming through in the Q&A as well. So it's probably worth your reflections on the points raised. Oh, you're muted, Michael, sorry.
Thanks. Some quick replies. First to Joe Littler. I think that Joe is right to emphasize gendered obstacles to equality. And I think, Joe, you make a good point that I don't develop those themes fully enough. I think those themes are compatible with the general argument I make, but I agree with you that they would require more development than I've given them in the book. For Maria, I certainly don't want to relegate human agency and freedom in the sense of dismissing it or extinguishing it or denying it. I certainly agree with you about that. I liked your formulation when you said we don't make our characters, but we can work on them. That's a lovely way of putting it. And that's the view of the cultivation of character that I think can make for a plausible account of human agency without attributing it to us, without leading us to claim that our success is our own doing. It's quite different from that. It involves human agency and responsibility, but short of the meritocratic claim that because I deserve my success, I deserve the benefits that the market bestows on them. I also am sympathetic to the idea, Maria, of there being a moral duty to make the most of one's talents rather than to let them lie dormant. But I think it's possible to make out that duty And you said it could be an understanding of talents and gifts derivative from nature or God or fate. I agree with that. And I think that there is a moral responsibility to cultivate our talents. But that's quite independent of regarding the fruits of the exercise of my talents as somehow uniquely or distinctly mine as a matter of desert. So I agree with your moral framing of questions of character and responsibility, but I don't think they support the idea that if everyone starts the race at the same place, the winners morally deserve their winnings. I think it's possible to affirm that the notions of agency and responsibility you have articulated without drawing that conclusion. As for Adrian, I heard you shift between two claims. First, you said first, where we agree. Let me say a word about that, Adrian. I agree that it's a good thing for the sake of productivity or the general welfare to align people's skills and talents with jobs and social roles that they will perform well. That's a good thing. It promotes economic efficiency and productivity. We have no disagreement about that. And setting in place incentives to encourage people not to be lazy, but to cultivate talents that the society requires on practical and utilitarian grounds. That's a good thing too. Nothing in my argument quarrels with that, Adrian. Where I saw you as wavering a bit is when it came to the question of the moral basis of deservingness. That, I think, is the issue between us, not the question of trying to promote the general welfare by aligning abilities with talents. I thought you slipped between two different answers to the question of deservingness when you said, first, we should reward people on the basis of effort. And then later, we're talking about hiring people at The Economist, when you said we should reward people on the basis of excellence. These are two different things. Just to test your view about this, we could put it to a very simple test. If I try harder, practice harder, and work harder at football than Messi, do I deserve to be paid more than Messi? Well, of course, now I'm guessing, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, Adrian, you would say no. But if you say no, then you're conceding, I think, that what meritocracy is about is not really rewarding people based on effort. It would reward people based on excellence or contribution. But if that's true, then we're back to the same problem about attributing deservingness based on talents that I am lucky to have.
Can I reply to that? Because we're talking about two slightly different things. The one is whether there is a moral basis to rewarding people on the basis of their achievements. If you're a pure genetic determinist, you'd say that they inherit their abilities and so they don't have any claim over them. I would say that you do have a claim over them because you have to turn raw talent into achievement via effort. And that is ultimately something that deserves a moral reward. The second is the efficiency of institutions, which is a different thing. It's not the economist doesn't. It's not a matter of the desert of the economist. It's the matter of we as an institution want to produce the best newspaper we possibly can, and in order to do that and maximize the general welfare by doing that, we appoint people on the basis of excellence, not mere competence. So one is what criteria institutions use to select people, and the other is whether there is a moral basis to rewarding people on the basis of effort.
Right, but on the hiring, we don't disagree. We don't disagree unless you want to say that the most excellent journalist should be hired for the job, not just because it will make for a better newspaper, but also because, morally speaking, she deserves it.
No, because what I'm saying is that that no self-respecting elite institution would ever say competence is enough, that we must select people on the basis of excellence. Or so we're looking for outstanding people, just as Harvard, when it hires a new employee, is looking for outstanding people. And that is what the whole meritocratic revolution was about. It was about saying, let's have open competition, objective measurements of people's abilities and promise, and therefore let's let institutions. This is a revolution that started off with institutions trying to improve themselves, schools, universities trying to improve themselves, and I think that is a different thing, but an equally important thing from the question of moral claims to different differentials in reward.
But without the, and I know others should jump in here and may have thoughts, but without the moral claims about who deserves what, you don't really have anything other than a perfectly sensible utilitarian defense of maximizing the general welfare by aligning people's abilities with their roles.
This is where meritocracy comes from. If you look at the mid-19th century, when you get the great meritocratic revolution, you got people saying these institutions, educational institutions, civil service institutions, are no good because they use principles of nepotism and patronage and purchase. Therefore, we must replace these with a different set of principles. Those principles are open competition, examinations to determine ability and promise. So the whole nature of meritocracy is rooted in reform of institutions to make institutions as good as possible at selecting people, sifting people on the basis of their abilities and promise.
I just thank you, Adrian. Yeah. So, Michael, is there any other thing? I'm just conscious we want to bring all the panel in to the discussion. Is there any other response points?
Well, the one other point I would make is it's an important question. What are the alternatives to meritocracy? I think there's not one. I think there are a range of alternatives politically and philosophically, ranging from a Hayekian free market to Rawlsian or otherwise social democracy that emphasizes the importance, since we don't deserve the full measure of the rewards the market bestows upon us, we should agree to share one another's fate through various schemes of solidarity as embodied in the welfare state, for example. That would be the social democratic alternative. But it's important to notice that one can reject meritocracy without even being a social democrat. One can reject meritocracy, as Hayek himself did, and favor a laissez-faire free market society. Hayek emphasized that having the talents the market prizes is no doing of the talented. And whether my gifts are in great demand or in low demand is not my doing. That's to do with the contingencies of markets. So Hayek came to the defense of the free market by rejecting meritocracy. So the alternatives to meritocracy could range from a Hayekian free market economy to a social democratic solidaristic society. That's more to my taste than the Hayekian. But from the standpoint of this debate about meritocracy, there are a range, politically, a range of alternatives, because what's really at stake is how we justify the way we distribute income and wealth and power. That's what's at stake in the debate over meritocracy, not whether we wind up with a free market economy or with some version of a social democratic welfare state.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. So I'll let that run because actually a lot of, as I say, a lot of the questions in the Q&A reflected some of the points Adrian was raising. So it's good to cover those. But I just wanted to check if Maria or Joe had any thoughts on that before we go on to a couple of other questions that we've got from the audience. Yes, Joe.
Just to say quickly, I think there's a serious danger in what Adrian is doing in eliding democracy with meritocracy. And there's a long tradition of critical thought that posits that as historically inaccurate. So, for example, in Histories of Education, we might think of Peter Mandler's recent book, The Crisis of the Meritocracy. He explicitly says that the meritocracy is something which is opposed to democracy. It's a very selective form of facilitating privilege rather than democratizing education for the many.
I wanted to make a couple of points on the sort of what we deserve. I think I agree that when we succeed, it's not wholly our doing, but I was trying to say, I think in agreement with Adrian, that it is sometimes partly our doing. And that means that we deserve some reward for that. And then it seems to me there are two different questions. One is what kind of reward we might deserve, both financial in terms of status and so on. And a different question, which shouldn't be conflated, what's the moral merit in having done what we have achieved? And that's a much harder question, I think, and they should be kept separate. I don't think the financial or status reward is, as it were, reflects the moral merit. Those, I think, should be separate. Though there is the moral issue that we contribute to our success through the striving and effort. That's not purely a matter of luck. That was my point about character.
Great. So, I mean, this kind of a couple of questions from the audience on this that sort of pick up on these things, and we've touched on this, but I just wanted to put it fairly specifically. One Ashka Tank asks, while an increase in humility and dignity sounds much fairer, don't we think that unforeseen outcomes of this could be complacency, disincentivizing wealth creators, and less productivity? How do we respond to that? Michael first, and then others to chip in.
Well, productivity, generally speaking, is a good thing, and we should encourage it, depending, of course, on what's being produced and how it's distributed. And this is a point that Adrian has raised very powerfully. We don't want to do away with incentives that call forth people's best efforts. And surely Adrian's right about that. I don't think we disagree about that. The question is whether, beyond practical incentives to promote efficiency and productivity, we need the full moral apparatus of deservingness in order to elicit from people the exercise of their talents in a way that serves the common good. I think not. And I think that when we do enlist that full apparatus of meritocracy, which goes far beyond simply resisting nepotism and cronyism and corruption, and attributes moral desert to the successful, I think that's when we create a kind of toxic politics, encourage hubris among the winners and humiliation among the losers. This was the worry that Michael Young had when he wrote that influential book, putting meritocracy as a term into common usage. He saw it as a dystopia. He glimpsed how it would devolve into this, to the hubris on the one hand and the humiliation on the other, a society of winners and losers. I think he was right about that. And I think we can resist that tendency, which is bound up with the attribution of deservingness to the successful, without necessarily undermining efficiency or productivity in an economy. Here's another, if I could just add, Bobby, another way of thinking about it is, if need be, if people who are very talented won't exercise their talents, we could bribe them. That's another word for an economic incentive. We could bribe them to work hard on behalf of the common good. But no one would mistake that bribe, which is purely for the sake of productivity in this example. No one would confuse that with the conferring of an honor. Compare that, on the other hand, to awarding a Medal of Valor to a soldier who displayed great courage in an important moment. that would be based on a claim of moral deservingness that would be quite independent of questions of efficiency, productivity, and incentives. So in principle, these are two different considerations: efficiency, incentives, productivity on the one hand, and attributions of moral desert on the other.
I think there's a very fundamental question here, which is whether hubris and humiliation are absolutely essential to the way that meritocracy operates, or whether they are incidental to it, in the sense that we have a particular version of meritocracy, let's say in the United States and Great Britain, in which these two things are indeed a problem. But do you need to have them? If we go back to the late 19th century, when meritocracy really took off as a system, we had elite educational institutions which spent a great deal of effort and time encouraging humility in the winners through studying the Bible, through studying the classics, and through a regime of very austere living. And they were very distinctly designed to create a sense of duty in those who were fortunate. And indeed, what they did was to take a very haughty and self-indulgent aristocracy and mold it into a much more responsible ruling class. So it's not inconceivable that we could try and do the same thing again, particularly emphasizing to people the degree to which you have a system of genetic luck. What we have at the moment is in many ways the worst possible world, in which people are absolutely persuaded that they deserve it at the top, and that it's purely based on work rather than any system of luck, either in the nature of the market or the nature of their talents. We need to deal with that. Our elite institutions need to deal with that. But the second is the sense of humiliation in the losers. That's certainly the case if you don't have if you have a stagnant economy at the bottom, or if you don't have any system of good vocational education, apprenticeships, or the rest of it. But in Germany, where you do have these things, you have much less of a problem with the humiliation at the bottom, and much more of a sense of pride in being a worker, in being somebody who crafts things with their hands, because that's what their education system have done. We have a system of selection by elimination almost. You lose the race, you're out of it. They have a system of selection by differentiation. You haven't lost the race, you've just been allocated to a different stream in which a different set of talents can be expressed. And it's very notable that in Britain and the United States, you've had a very vigorous rejection of meritocracy on the part of populists, and you haven't seen anything like that, like as much of that in Germany, because I think there's much less sense that if you're a craftsman, you've failed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the...
If I could just quickly say, Bobby, here I think my position and Adrian's are coming closer together, because what he describes is an education in humility, emphasizing duty rather than deservingness. I find that attractive. I also agree that the German system of vocational education is an important corrective to the tendencies that are prominent in the US and the UK, where it's as if we construe society as a race rather than as a differentiated way of contributing. So once we're on the terrain, Adrian, that you've just laid out, I think we're in agreement. Maybe the only disagreement then is whether this moral educational frame of humility, duty rather than desert, affirming the dignity of work, rejecting society, the image of society as a competitive race, affirming differentiated contributions, whether that counts as meritocracy, I think would be the question. But what you've just laid out there, I think is much closer to the kind of picture that I take to be a desirable alternative to the meritocratic competition that predominates today.
Yes, I mean, one of the key things I took from the book in current policy discussion context is that greater emphasis on production rather than consumption, and the importance of that shift of focus, particularly in the UK right now, with a focus on levelling up as an agenda, not seeing that as a consumption-driven, pure GDP growth, etc. It is about dignity and respect for what people contribute. And And it's really important not to misread that. And I think the book and lots of the other discussions around this is very important to get that right. I've got one more question I wanted to try to get in, but I did want to, Joe or Maria, any reflections on that point? Yes, please, Joe.
Sure. Well, cycling back to the question on financial incentives, I think we could point out that the system in which, we've seen, for example, Jeff Bezos get an extra $86 billion during the pandemic isn't working out incredibly brilliantly in terms of the extent to which wealth is being funneled to the super rich. And we can think about what humans are motivated by, and it's more than finance. So often the debate circles around as just being motivated by money, but humans are motivated by so much, self-realization, collective realization, survival, joy. So I think it's very important that we don't minimize that. And also that in relation to that, we think about how we are valuing jobs, how we are valuing roles, as Ruth Lister says in the chat. There are some social roles which have been very minimized and financially badly rewarded because they're associated with women, like care, for example. So I think that needs to be on the table.
Absolutely. That's such a key point. Thank you, Joe. And Maria, anything to add on?
Only a small point about the extent to which the losers feel humiliated. I think perhaps partly humiliated, but I think perhaps partly cheated by realizing that there is no real equality of opportunity, and so on, that in reality, as it's been said many times, that it's all rigged. And so I don't know that it is that meritocracy must generate those things. It's when it's a sort of charade of meritocracy that also generates that sense of humiliation and rage and yeah.
Great, thank you, Maria. So I am going to try and squeeze one in, but it's probably also any final points you want to make. So you don't have to necessarily answer this question, but you can come with anything else. I think it's a useful, interesting one. It's from Ryan Wayne, who asks, do we have a political talent problem whereby the wrong people are going into politics, and that's helping to breed resentment around the widening chasm between successful people and ordinary people? And if we can just maybe go in reverse order. So Maria, do you want to go first, and then Adrian?
I suppose, this would take a very long time to answer, but I imagine it's partly the perception of lack of merit and of self-serving attitudes that makes people, that in the ways in which politicians are seen not to be, as it were, to have the right talents and attitudes, I think.
Thank you, Maria. Adrian, any reflections on that or anything else before?
I think that if you have a situation in which America is confronted with the choice in the last election, as it was, between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, you have more than the problem, you have a catastrophe.
Thank you. Succinct. Very good. And Joe, any reflections on that, or more broadly?
I do think we have a problem, yes, in that we've seen the professionalization of politics over the past few decades and a consequent populist revolt and response. And I think we need to find ways to reconnect politics with the systems that represent us.
Michael, so any final reflections and any thoughts on political leadership's role in this?
Well, in answer to Ryan's question, do we have a dearth of political talent? Or the short answer is yes. And I think it's a striking feature of the way we are governed, that as meritocracy has intensified its hold on the public culture, and as the university credentials of members of parliament and of Congress have become more uniform, the credentialed, the meritocratic political class have governed actually very poorly in the last several decades. They've produced levels of inequality not seen since the 1920s. And they've produced a system that has unraveled basically the moral and civic ties that hold us together. So I think part of the problem with meritocratic hubris, if we look at the political class, is that the so-called meritocrats have governed very poorly. I think this is connected to a point I just want to pick up on that Joe made earlier about the variety and the diversity of motivations. We talk a lot about incentives, especially in market societies like ours, getting the incentives right, putting the right incentives in place to maximize GDP or productivity. And incentives are important, but typically the incentives refer to economic incentives. But I think Joe is right that people are motivated by a wide range of purposes and ends, including self-realization and feeling that they are making a valuable contribution to the common good and winning recognition for the contributions they make. I think part of what set us apart so deeply in recent decades is the legitimate anger and resentment that many working people have over the fact that the society seems not to appreciate and to recognize the contributions they make. It seemed for a moment during the pandemic that this might change. Those of us with the luxury of working from home couldn't help but notice how deeply we depend on workers we often overlook. Delivery workers, warehouse workers, grocery store clerks, childcare workers, home healthcare providers. These are not the best paid or most honored workers in our society. And yet during the pandemic, we began calling them key workers, essential workers, sometimes applauding them, clapping for them. And so it could be a moment for a broader public debate about how to bring their pay and recognition into better alignment with the importance of the work they do. But all of this requires that we resist the temptation to assume that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good, the measure of their merit, of the social value of what they contribute. And that means we need to reclaim as democratic citizens judgments about what counts as social value, as a genuine contribution. And this means overcoming our tendency to outsource our moral judgments to markets. So it seems to me there are some surprising points of overlap in this discussion, as well as some and as well as taking seriously, certainly from my part, some of the considerations that have exacerbated inequality, even beyond the divide between winners and losers that I've connected to the tyranny of merit, Bobby.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. But before I give final thanks to everyone, I just wanted to flag that this is the first brilliant edition in this series that we're running on related topics with the Fairness Foundation in the new year. I think we've just posted in the chat that we will have some Michael Marmot on the health gap in January, then Professor Selina Todd on her book on Snakes and Ladders, Great British Social Mobility Myth, and then that's in February, and then in March we'll have Baroness Manoush Shafiq on her book on What We Owe Each Other, a new social contract. So a great series with the Fairness Foundation. So all that's left for me to do is to thank you all for coming. Sorry, we've run just a couple of minutes over, but hope you enjoyed a really excellent discussion. I want to thank the teams at the Policy Institute and the Fairness Foundation for putting this together, including Will Snell. And of course, finally, to thank our really excellent panel and of course, Michael Sandel. Thank you all.
Thanks.